The Introduction to the Old Testament, Unit 11, Part 2, the period of the Judges. We began with Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, and Jair. We continue now with Jephthah. In chapter 10, verse 6, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths and the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, he became angry with them. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, who that year shattered and crushed them. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead, the land of the Amorites. They also crossed to fight against Judah, Benjamin, and the house of Ephraim. And the people then called out to the Lord, and the Lord replied, when the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, the Amalekites, and the Maonites oppressed you, and you cried to me for help, did I not save you from their hands? But you have forsaken me and served other gods, so I will no longer save you. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you when you are in trouble. But again, the Israelites said that they have sinned and they want God to help them. Then we have Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. And the full sons of Gilead drove Jephthah away, saying that he could not inherit with them. So he went away to the land of Tov, where a group of adventurers gathered around him and followed him. So he has a small army that is around him. And when the people of Gilead need him, they go to Jephthah and ask him to lead them. Jephthah answered in verse 9 of chapter 11, suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head? And they said, yes, he would. And so the first thing that Jephthah does is to send word to the Ammonites and wants to know why they are now trying to fight against Israel. In chapter 11, verse 14, Jephthah sent messengers back to the Ammonite king, and he gives a history of the area, and that the Israelites have been in possession of this for hundreds of years. But in verse 28, we are told that the king of Ammon paid no attention to the message of Jephthah. And then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. Unfortunately, Jephthah made a vow. He says, if God gives me the victory, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house. I imagine he was hoping that a dog or a cow or something like this would come out, but it is his only child, a daughter. And since God gave Jephthah the victory, he then sacrificed his only child as a sacrifice to the Lord. Then Jephthah has problem with the Ephraimites. Remember when Gideon had called them out, they were a little feisty then and said, why didn't you call us out first? Well, again, when Jephthah wins the victory and they've seen that he has won, Then they come to him and want to know, why didn't you call for us? Again, they're wanting plunder from the enemy. So they say that they're going to burn down Jephthah and his house. There is a civil war that takes place between the army of Jephthah and the Ephraimites. And this is a very interesting situation where you have Jephthah defeating the Ephraimites. And there are many of the Ephraimites still in Gilead, and they want to get home. They have to cross the Jordan River. And it says in verse 5 of chapter 12, the Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan leading to Ephraim, and whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, let me cross over, the men of Gilead asked him, are you an Ephraimite? If he replied, no, they said, all right, say Shibboleth. And since the people of Ephraim could not pronounce it properly, they said Sibboleth rather than Shibboleth, then they were killed. So you see dialectical differences in the language of the people. It says in verse 7 of chapter 12, Jephthah led Israel 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in a town of Gilead. And then we have 3 more judges mentioned, very small ones. In verse 8, after him, Ibzan of Bethlehem led Israel. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters. He gave his daughters away in marriage to those outside his clan, and for his sons he brought in 30 young women as wives from outside his clan. He led Israel 7 years. And then verse 11, Elon the Zebulunite led Israel 10 years. Elon died and was buried in Ayalon in the land of Zebulun. Now, nothing said about him other than the fact that he led Israel 10 years. And then after him, Abdon, son of Hillel, from Pirathon, led Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons, and all of them rode on their own donkey. He led Israel 8 years. Then Abdon, son of Hillel, died and was buried at Pirathon in Ephraim, in the hill country of the Amalekites. I imagine there was some additional information, but we are not given any for these 3 judges. Then comes Samson, and most of you are aware of Samson. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. And there is a certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites. He had a wife who was sterile and remained childless. An angel of the Lord appeared to her and told her that she was going to become pregnant and give birth to a son, and that she is to name him Samson. Her husband wasn't with her at this time, but again the angel appeared to her, and then she went and got her husband and brought him, because they want to know, how are they supposed to raise this son? In verse 12 of chapter 13, Manoah asked him, when your words are fulfilled, what is to be the rule for the boy's life and work? And so he repeated what he had told the wife earlier. He has to be a Nazirite, not cut his hair or drink any wine or other fermented drink, nor eat anything unclean. Now you see that Samson really doesn't live up to the standards of the Nazirite. And then the angel in verse 20, as a flame blazed up from the altar toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame. And so there is a son born to her. He is named Samson, and we aren't told anything about his young life, but in chapter 14 it says that Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. Now God has raised up Samson to be a thorn in the flesh of the Philistines. So anything that happens that seems out of the ordinary, this is God's doing. Well, the parents want to know, why can't he marry a good Jewish woman? But he wants her. And so it says in verse 4, his parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. So Samson went to Timnah along with his father and mother, and as he is approaching the vineyards of Timnah, there is a young lion that came roaring out of the background. And it says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he doesn't tell his parents what he has done. Sometime later, when he went back to marry the girl, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass. In verse 8, in it was a swarm of bees and some honey, which he scooped out with his hands and ate as he went along. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some. Now the lion is dead. His carcass is where the bees have built their hive. So this means that the honey is not kosher. But he eats it and he gives some to his parents. And then he married the woman. He is given 30 companions to be with him. And he says to them in verse 12, let me tell you a riddle. If you can give me the answer within the 7 days of the feast, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't tell me the answer, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. So he tells them the riddle, out of the eater, something to eat, out of the strong, something sweet. Well, they aren't able to guess. They finally appeal to his wife and says, you better find out what the answer is, or we will burn you and your father. She starts crying around, and Samson then finally tells her the answer. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? So Samson said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. So he knows how they got the answer. Well, he has to supply them then with the 30 garments, and he goes shopping in Ashkelon. Ashkelon is on the seacoast. It is another one of the major Philistine cities. And it says that he struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of their belongings, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. So he takes care of his debt. Later on, Samson thinks that he will go and visit his wife. Now, it's interesting that this is a common factor in the ancient East. It is an Arabu marriage, where the wife lives with her parents and her husband visits her at their home. So this seems to be what has happened here with Samson. Well, when he goes to the home, he finds out that the daughter has been given to the best man. And Samson is a little ticked off at this. He's offered the younger daughter, what the father says is even prettier, but he's not satisfied. So what he does is he goes out into the countryside and he catches these foxes, or it may be another small animal, but it serves the same purpose. He has enough of these that he ties their tails together, and then he put a torch in the tail, and the foxes run through the grain fields and burn all of the stalks and the standing grain, together with the vineyards and olive groves. And when the Philistines find out that this was done by Samson, then they burned her and her father to death. So Samson then has another reason for take vengeance on the Philistines, and he has gone down to a cave at the rock of Elam. In verse 9 of chapter 15, the Philistines went up and camped in Judah, spreading out near Lehi. The men of Judah asked, "Why have you come to fight us?" And they give their reason. And so these men of Judah go to Samson in the cave. There are 3,000 men. They say, "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" They said, "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." They promise they are not going to take action against him. So they tie him, and then they hand him over to the Philistines. It says in verse 14, as he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. And then he is a little tired as a result of this activity, and he's thirsty, and God opens up a place for water. It says that God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned and he revived. So the spring was called Ein HaKorah, and it is still there in Lehi. Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Now normally we'd say, well, we're finished with Samson. We're not yet, because chapter 16 goes on and tells us about this woman, Delilah. Samson is in love with her, and he spends a lot of time with her, and the leaders of the Philistines come to her and promise her a large sum of money. Each of the 5 rulers will give her 1,100 shekels of silver. So she then tries to find out from Samson why he is so strong. Chapter 16 and verse 7, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh thongs that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as other men." So she has these 7 thongs that haven't been dried. She ties up Samson, and then she says, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the thongs as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a fire. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You've made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." So he gives her another one. "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man." You remember that the Israelites had tied up Samson with ropes, and they didn't work. And this doesn't either, but she tries it and says, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." but he snapped the ropes on his arms as if they were threads. In chapter 16, verse 13, Delilah then said to Samson, "Until now you have been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied." He replied, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with a pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." Notice he's getting much closer to the real thing that gives him strength. So she does this. She braids the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric and tightened it with a pin. And she says, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep, pulled up the pin and the loom with the fabric. And then she says, "How can you say, 'I love you'?" And Samson should have said, "How can you say you love me since you've tried all of these things?" But he doesn't. He then tells her, "No razor has ever been on my head, because I have been a Nazirite set apart to God since birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." So this she does again. And it says she called a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him. And then she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And now he realizes he has no strength. So they take him, they put out his eyes, and then took him down to Gaza, bound him with bronze shackles, and set him to grinding in the prison. But then it says the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. That is important. Now they are going to celebrate in the temple. It says the rulers of the Philistines, in verse 23, assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." And they bring Samson in so that he can perform before them and entertain them. They called Samson out of the prison. He performed for them. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." It says the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "O sovereign Lord, remember me, O God. Please strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And so he braced himself against the pillars and pushed them over, and the temple came down. It says the temple came down on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. And then his family came and took the body and buried it in the tomb of his father, Manoah. Now that ends what we call the book of Judges. But at the end of the book, there are 2 other events that take place. And one is the idols of Micah, and the other is the Levite who has a concubine in Bethlehem. Now in chapter 17, we are told that Micah had stolen some money from his mother. And this was quite a large sum, 1,100 shekels of silver. She pronounced a curse on the person who had stolen it, and then Micah owned up to it. So then she pronounces a blessing to counteract the curse. Then she takes some of the money and gives it to the metal worker to make a cast idol. She took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to a silversmith, who made them into the image and the idol, and they were put in Micah's house. Micah built a shrine, and he had an ephod and some idols along with this image, and he appointed one of his sons as priest. And it says, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Now that is one of the themes that runs through the book of Judges. And then we are told in verse 7 of chapter 17, a young Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, who had been living within the clan of Judah, left that town in search of some other place to stay. On his way, he came to Micah's house in the hill country of Ephraim. When Micah found out that he was a Levite, then he invited him to become his priest. So he became a priest in the household of Micah. Then we are told of something else that was taking place. The Israelites have not secured all of their land, and the tribe of Dan has been thwarted in their effort because the people that had their land had iron chariots and a strong army, and Dan could not subdue them. And so they decided that they would move someplace else. So they sent 5 of their men, and they went out to find a place, and they stopped by the house of Micah, and this Levite told them that they would be successful. In chapter 18, in those days Israel had no king. And in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking a place of their own where they might settle. And they sent 5 warriors from Zorah and Eshtaol to spy out the land. After they left the house of Micah, they went north, and they came to a city, Laish, and it was a very nice area. The land was good, and so they decided that they would replace these people in Laish. They returned to Zorah and Eshtaol, and the brothers asked them, "How did you find things?" They answered, "Come on, let's attack them. We have seen that the land is very good." They set out then with 600 men from the clan of the Danites, armed for battle. They take their families with them. They camped near Kiryat Yarim in Judah, and it says this is why the place west of Kiryat Yarim is called Mahane Dan to this day, the camp of Dan. From there they went on to the hill country of Ephraim and came to Micah's house. The 5 men then went into the house, and they are going to take all that is in the shrine, the idol and the ephod and whatever else is there. It says that verse 17 of chapter 18, the 5 men who had spied out the land went inside and took the carved image, the ephod, the other household gods, and the cast idol, while the priest and the 600 armed men stood at the entrance to the gate. And then the priest is wanting to know what they're going to do. And they said, it's better for you to be a priest to a whole tribe than just to a single house. And so he went with them because this is to his advantage. When they had gone some distance, Micah and his neighbors came after them. They asked, "What's the matter with you?" And he replied, "You took the gods I made and my priest and went away. What else do I have? How can you say, 'What's the matter with you?'" But they were 600 in number. He knew he couldn't fight against them, and so they told him to go home, and this is what he did. And then they took what Micah had made and his priest and went on to Laish against the peaceful and unsuspecting people. They attacked them with the sword, burned down their city. There was no one to rescue them because they lived a long way from Sidon and had no relationship with anyone else. The city was in a valley near Beth Rehob. The Danites rebuilt the city and settled there. They named it Dan after their forefather Dan. There the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan. So you notice here that a son from Moses is their priest, and contrary to what is supposed to be done, he is serving in this shrine. Now there is another story, and that is the Levite and his concubine. He lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, and he took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. For some reason, the concubine left him and went home. Well, after a while, he went after her to see if he couldn't persuade her to return. He arrived at her home. Her father was very happy to see him. He remained with him 3 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. And then on the 4th day, he wanted to go. But the father-in-law says, well, why don't you eat something first, and then you can go. Well, they did that, and it was so late that he didn't go. The same thing happened the next day. When the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said, look, it's almost evening. Spend the night here. The day is nearly over. Stay and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow morning, you can get up and be on your way. Well, that's what he had told him the day before, and it didn't happen. But he decided he had to leave now. And so they left Bethlehem, and they went toward Jebus, that is Jerusalem. And when they were near Jebus, and the day was almost gone, the servant said to his master, come, let's stop at this city of the Jebusites and spend the night. But they didn't want to go into a city of foreigners. So they were going to go on and try to find a city of Israelites. And so they went on trying to reach Gibeah or Ramah and spend the night. And they went on, the sun set as they neared Gibeah in Benjamin. They stopped to spend the night. They went in and sat in the square, but no one took them into his home. But there was an old man from the hill country of Ephraim who was living in Gibeah. He came from his work and he invited them to his home. In verse 21, he took them into his house and fed his donkeys, and they had washed their feet, and they had something to eat and drink. And while they're enjoying themselves, the men of the city of Gibeah come to the door, and they want this man to come out so that they could have sex with him. The old man doesn't want to do this. You really have an obligation when you invite a person into your home. You're supposed to protect them. The owner of the house went outside and said to them, no, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this disgraceful thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But to this man, don't do such a disgraceful thing. Notice that the man is ready to sacrifice his own daughter to prevent this from happening. But it says the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them. They raped her and abused her throughout the night, and at dawn they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. He comes, opens the door, and tells her to get up, but she is dead. The man put her on his donkey, set out for home, and when he reached home, he took a knife and cut her up into several pieces and sent the pieces throughout the tribes of Israel. All of the Israelites, it says, from Dan to Beersheba, and from the land of Gilead, came as one man and assembled before the Lord in Mizpah. They want these men that have performed this atrocity to be punished. And they ask the men of Gibeah to hand them over. But they refuse to do this. So they decide they are going to attack the city of Gibeah and punish them. In verse 18 it says, the Israelites went up to Bethel and inquired of God. They said, who of us shall go first to fight against the Benjamites? The Lord replied, Judah shall go first. So the next morning they attacked Gibeah, but the men of Gibeah took battle positions and cut down 22,000 Israelites on the battlefield that day. The men of Israel encouraged one another, again took up their positions where they had stationed themselves the first day, and again they lose thousands of soldiers. It says they cut down 18,000 Israelites, all of them armed with swords. Then the Israelites went to Bethel to find out what they should do. And they fasted that day until evening, and they inquired of the Lord. And it says, in those days the ark of the covenant of God was there with Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron. They asked, shall we go up again to battle with Benjamin, our brother, or not? The Lord responded, go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands. So the Israelites set an ambush around Gibeah, and they went up against Gibeah as they did before, and when the Gibeonites came out, they began to retreat, and the Gibeonites came out of the city to pursue them. And then the ambush went in and took the city of Gibeah. 10,000 of Israel's finest men made a frontal attack on Gibeah. The fighting was so heavy that the Benjamites did not realize how near disaster was. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and on that day the Israelites struck down 25,100 Benjamites, all armed with swords. Then the Benjamites saw that they were beaten. There were 600 of the Benjamites who fled and took refuge in the desert at the rock of Rimmon. Now, you have a tribe of Benjamin that is almost entirely wiped out. And the Israelites, when they realize this, they say, we've got to do something about it. And so they do a census and find out that the men of Jabesh Gilead did not come to battle against their enemy. In chapter 21, verse 10, the assembly sent 12,000 fighting men with instructions to go to Jabesh Gilead and put to the sword those living there, including the women and children. And this was what you are to do. Kill every male and every woman who is not a virgin. They found among the people living in Jabesh Gilead 400 young women who had never slept with a man, and they took them to the camp of Shiloh in Canaan. Now they gave these 400 young virgins to the men of Gibeah, but there were 600 who had survived, and so they have to do something about them. And so they realized that there was a pageant that was held every year near Shiloh. They instructed the Benjamites in verse 20, "Go and hide in the vineyards and watch. When the girls of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, then rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize a wife from the girls of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. If when their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, 'Do us a kindness by helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war, and you are innocents, since you did not give your daughters to them.'" And so that's what they did. And at that time, the Israelites left that place and went home to their tribes and clans, each to his own inheritance. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit.